Before we start stitching, we need to address this question. Where do we begin? And what I mean by that is literally, where do we begin? Do we start in the corner of our piece? Do we start in the center of our piece? Where are we going to place that first stitch? My general preference is that I will start in the top left-hand corner for full coverage, and I will start in the middle for everything else. Why is that? Because most cross-stitch designs are not perfectly square or perfectly rectangular. So trying to start in a corner with a piece that's not perfectly even on all sides is actually quite difficult, because you have to do a lot of calculations. If it's square, if it's got flat sides, it makes it a lot easier, as I'm sure you can appreciate. So that's my preference. You of course start wherever you want, but I'm just going to show you a few tips for starting in the top corner or in any corner if that's what you want to do, and then a few tips for starting in the middle of the fabric and of course the middle of the chart. In order to figure out where we're going to place our first stitch if we start in a corner, we first of all have to figure out how big our final stitched piece, so the actual design, is going to be. Now sometimes it'll give you this on the chart, but I'm just going to show you how to calculate it if it doesn't give you the final stitched area. Now there are online calculators that you can use and they're really, really handy, but if you want to do it by hand, it's really very simple, and I'm just going to show you now. So the first thing we need is our stitch count, and where are we going to get that? Well, we're going to get that on the chart. I have never come across a cross-stitch chart that doesn't give us our stitched count, or stitch count. So this particular chart that I'm just showing you as a sample is 121 stitches across and 179 stitches high. So that's the first thing we need. Now, we need our fabric count. Now I'm going to be stitching this on 28 count, 28 count even weave, but I am stitching over two, so over 2 threads of the fabric. And what does that mean? It means that I'm stitching in every second thread, or every second hole, I should say. And so what we're actually stitching on, if we're stitching over 2 on 28 count, we're really only stitching in every second hole. So we're actually not stitching in 28 holes for the inch. We are actually stitching in 14 holes per inch. So if we stitch over 28 count even weave or 28 count linen over 2, it's pretty much the same as stitching over 14 count Aida. So 14 is the number we need to think about here. 14 holes, excuse my dreadful handwriting, 14 holes per inch. So we take this number, 121, divided by 14. Now if you were very clever, you might know how to do this by, in your head, but I certainly am not, so I'm going to get out my old calculator, which I think is on the way out. It looks very dark. Anyway, 121 divided by 14, that gives us 8.64. And then I'll do it the same with our height. 179 divided by 14, 179 divided by 14 is 12.79, we might say. So what are these figures? Well, they're the inches. So it's going to be 8.64 inches wide and 12.79 roughly inches high. Now, you might prefer to work in inches. I have to say, I can't really think in inches, so I convert back into centimeters, and here's my conversion. 1 inch is 2.54 centimeters. So if I say 8.64 multiplied by 2.54, that is 21.95 centimeters by 12.79 multiplied by 2.54, and that gives us 32.48 centimeters. So there's the measurement of our final stitched piece. The actual stitched design will be 21.95 centimeters across by 32.48 centimeters high. Now that I have the measurements of our stitched area, I'm just going to double check the dimensions of our piece of fabric. And I'm not going to include the selvage edge here. You can, it doesn't make a huge difference. I'm not going to because, you know, we would never actually stitch on that selvage edge. But again, it doesn't make a massive difference in the grand scheme of things. So starting then from the edge of our selvage edge, we are going to say, I'm going to bring it over here, maybe 36 centimeters, 36 and a half, but I'm just going to say 36. So I'm just going to make note of that. 36 centimeters across. And if I go from top to bottom, and you'll notice I haven't zigzag stitched, well I have on this side, but I haven't zigzag stitched the other two sides, so that's very naughty and I need to see to that. What are we down here? You probably can't see, but we are 51 centimeters. So 36 centimeters across by 51 centimeters high. So then this is the dimensions of our actual piece of fabric. So now that we have the measurements of our fabric, we need to see what our surplus or excess is going to be. So quite simple. So we're going to take the horizontal measurement first, 36 centimeters minus 21.95 centimeters. And again, I'm going to take out my old calculator, which I think is nearly as old as I am. 21.95. That leaves us with, it's 14.05, but we're just going to say 14 centimeters. Let's not start splitting hairs. And then the vertical is 51 centimeters minus 32.48. Probably could have called that 32.5, but here we are. 51 minus 32.48 is 18.52. 18.5. Now, what do? We divide these by 2. Why are we doing that? Because we know that we have 14 centimeters total surplus on the sides, but of course we're not just going to have 14 centimeters extra on one side and 0 on the other, so we are going to divide it by 2. So 14 divided by 2, don't think we need the calculator for that, 7 centimeters. And 18.5 divided by 2 is 9.25. Is that right? 9.25, I think. When you get old, your brain doesn't work as well. Yeah, 9.25. So that is our surplus. So we're going to have 7 centimeters extra on the sides and 9.25 centimeters extra on the top and the bottom. So we know our surplus now, and all we need to do is get out our tape measure. And what do we need? So we need 7 centimeters on the side. So we're going to measure in 7. That's 9, 7. I'm going to just put my little pointer here. That's how far we're going in, and what are we going from the top? 9.25. Line that up. 9.25, about there. So I'm going to say that would be where I would start. And just to be absolutely certain, I'm going to measure across. So our stitched design is, what is it? 21.95 centimeters. So we go across by 21.95, say 22, and then there should be 7. Do you see that? So we've another 7 here. So we know that our piece is going to be pretty central. And if I did that top to bottom, that would work out the same. So that's how we find our starting point if we're going to be starting in a corner. I've obviously gone top left corner here. You can start in any corner, but this would always be my preference, top left. And again, I would really only use this method when I am stitching full coverage or anything with flat sides or straight sides. To start in the middle of your piece, which again is my preferred method, you first of all have to find the middle of your actual chart. And on this chart here, you will see this Bothy Threads chart that came in a kit. And obviously I'm trying not to show you the actual symbols, but at the bottom we see this arrow and then a line going up. So if we follow this arrow up, eventually we're going to come to the center of the piece. And then if I take out the next page, and again, try not to show you the symbols, we have another arrow here at the side. So we would follow this arrow across and the other arrow up, and at the point where they intersect, which is actually marked on the chart, but I can't show you, that is the place where we start. I've just dropped my chart. Okay. And then I have another one here to show you. Again, trying not to get too far in, but here on this chart you can see an arrow on the side and here we go, an arrow at the bottom. So again, you would follow those 2 arrows or the lines from those 2 arrows, and eventually you reach a point of intersection. And at that point of intersection, that is the middle of your chart, and that's where you would place your first stitch if you were going to be stitching, starting in the middle. So when it comes to finding the center of our fabric, if you want to take out your measuring tape and do it that way, you can, of course, but I suppose the easier way is just to fold over the fabric. Don't mind my loose threads here. And again, I'm only just going to fold to the edge of the selvage here, but you could fold it the whole way across. It's not going to make a massive difference. So I folded it over, and then I'm going to fold from top to bottom, like so. Is that straight? Just about. And then we have a corner here, and that corner is the center of our fabric. So what you could do is you could stick a pin through it, or if we unfold our fabric, you can see that it's actually left this cross in the fabric. I don't know if you can see, but it has left a cross where our fold lines were. The center of that cross is where we're going to place our first stitch. And often what I would do in that case is, before putting it into a hoop or anything, I might just maybe put in my first stitch or put in a temporary stitch, or even just stick a pin through it just to mark that center of the fabric, because when it goes into the hoop, that cross is not always as clear when a little bit of tension is applied to the fabric. So now it's time to put our fabric into its hoop. You might prefer to use a Q-snap or a frame, but I'm just going to use a hoop. So I'll just take away the top, and then I'm going to lay my fabric over the hoop, and I've just marked the center point of that cross with a needle. And then I'm just going to place my top hoop over and then give that a tighten. So I have my needle threaded with my strand of DMC doubled over. I've left the shorter tail as the 2 cut ends, and then the longer tail is this loop here. And I've done that for a specific reason, which you're going to see now in a second. So here's where we're starting. I'm going to pull out this needle, don't need that anymore. I'm going to start from the front of the fabric, insert my needle, pull my needle through, and you see it's left that little loop. And then because we're working over 2, I'm going to move diagonally, and then just move that out of the way. I'm going to pull my thread. So you see now we have our little loop, I should say, still popping out. We've come up in the top right hand corner of the stitch. Now I'm going to pop my needle through that loop, pull tight, and then I'm going to double back over myself and pop my needle back through that same hole which I just came out of. And what that's doing is it's pulling the actual knot that we've made to the back of the fabric. Then I'm going to come out my bottom right corner. So again, we're working over 2, so I'm going to skip the first hole, come into that second hole. We're always leaving an empty hole when we work over 2 on Evenweave or linen. So here we are, and then again in that top corner. So here, skip our hole, and then down. Now, and our thread is nice and secure. So that is our loop start method for working with 2 strands of cotton. When we are working over 2 on Evenweave or over 2 on linen, we always need to think that we're leaving a hole empty and that we're skipping over 2 threads rather than 1. So if I just show you here, I'm going to pop my needle up through here to make my first stitch. We're always moving diagonally in cross stitch to make our cross. And what we're doing is we're skipping over 1 and we're going into the second hole. Or what way I like to think about it sometimes is we're moving across, and so we're skipping this hole and moving into this hole. So there's the bottom leg of our stitch, and we always want to make sure that our bottom legs are facing in one direction and our top legs are facing in another direction. So for this piece, I will make sure that all of my bottom legs are going from bottom left to top right, and all of my top legs are going from bottom right to top left. So again, to make our second leg, here's where we came out. So we're skipping 1, leaving that empty, coming out here. And then of course we know where we need to go because we have that stitch. Now, so come up from the bottom, this little thread, and then again, leaving 1 hole empty, we go in, leaving 1 hole empty. So this hole we're not going to work into, we're going to work into this hole. This little thread over here doesn't want to leave me alone. And then down. Now, you can work the opposite way if you would prefer. So we could start in our top right hand corner and then bottom left. And then we would skip 1 hole, go into our second hole, and then in like that. So any way you prefer, really, as long as you are always keeping your bottom legs consistent and your top legs consistent. When we are stitching a horizontal row of the same colour, there's 2 general methods which you can choose from. So the first one is the English method, and the English method involves stitching each individual stitch before moving on to the next one. Now, a lot of people say that this is the proper way to do it, that this ensures the most even tension, and you know, there's people who just would not consider doing it any other way but this one. Sorry, I have a light kind of in my face, so I can't 100% see what I'm doing, but I hope this is making sense. So yeah, for our English method, each stitch is stitched individually, like so. And again, bottom left corner, skipping over our hole and our threads, and then the same thing. You'll notice that once you have a few stitches in the fabric, it becomes a lot easier because you kind of have a general guide of what your stitches are meant to look like. And you'll find that if you miss the mark, which we all do, it'll be quite apparent that you've done so, because your eye will just learn what the stitch is supposed to look like. So that's the English method, each stitch done individually. Now for the Dutch method or the Danish method. I'm not 100% sure where these names have come from, and I don't know why. There's a bit of a debate about whether it's the Danish method or the Dutch method. I don't know if anyone from Denmark or the Netherlands would have an answer to that. But you can see here, I hope, that what I'm doing is I'm stitching all of my bottom legs. So I'm just moving across, doing all of those bottom legs until my chart says that I've gone far enough. And no prizes now for guessing what I'm going to do next. Once I've finished this one, I am, of course, going to start turning back on myself and doing the top legs. So you can see, I mean, it looks pretty much the same. I prefer the second method, the Dutch method. I just find it faster. I also find it kind of fun. But like I said, a lot of people think the English method is the proper method. So it really is completely up to you. A lot of people would say then, well, what about vertically? You know, if you were doing a row this way, could you do the same thing? You know, do all the bottom legs and then turn back and do all the top legs? The answer is yes, you can. I personally don't like to do that. I just find it can kind of mess up the tension a little bit, and it can make your back a bit messy. But lots of people do it that way and it looks absolutely fine. So it's just personal, isn't it? But yeah, here we go. So we're going to place our final stitch. I hope they're all straight. Like I said, I can barely see, but that is our Dutch or our Danish method. So now I have finished my little section of 320, and I need to finish this thread and move on to a new thread, a different colour. So how am I going to do that? So what I do is I come to the back of my work, I take my needle and I just insert my needle through the back of a few of these stitches. Not always that easy, that should be enough. And then I'm going to pull my needle through if it wants to come, and that's going to pull the thread, and as you can see the thread is now locked behind these stitches, and I'm just going to take some embroidery scissors and snip off my excess thread, and now I am ready to start my new thread. So now I have threaded up my next thread, which is 319, another green. But this time, rather than taking one long strand and doubling it over, I have actually used two separate strands. And I want to show you a method that you can use when the loop start method won't work. So the loop start method will work if you've got one strand doubled over to make kind of two strands of the same colour. If you're using an uneven number of strands, or maybe two strands of a different colour, you know, one of 320, one of 319, that loop start method is not going to work because you won't have a loop. So I want to show you the waist knot method. So to use the waist knot method, we start by tying a knot close to the longer of our tails. I don't know if you can see that, but I do have a knot in my thread. And I want to place my stitch here, but I'm not going to start here. I'm going to start all the way over here. And I'm going to pop my needle in, pull my thread all the way through until it catches. So you can see here it's caught, and that's of course because the knot that I've tied is not allowing the thread to pass through the fabric. And now what I'm going to do is bring my needle up where I want to make that first stitch, and I am going to stitch away as normal. Now what will eventually happen is that thread that's carried along the back of my work over here, I'm going to be stitching over it. And what's going to happen is that thread will eventually get caught. and it'll get secured down by the back of the stitches that I'm going to stitch over. That's why we kind of start horizontally, so that that thread can then be caught. And eventually we'll get to the point where the thread is secure, and then I can just snip off that little knot and trim a little bit of the excess at the back. So that is the waist knot method, and it's great for situations where, like I said, you don't have a way of using the loop method. The waist knot method is a great alternative. Once you have a few stitches established, you don't need to use that waist knot anymore. What you can do is do something very similar to when we weaved in our tail end. You can just run your needle through the back of some already established stitches, give it a pull, and then that's going to secure our end in here, and then we can just bring our needle back around to the front of the fabric and stitch as normal. Now look what's happened here. I was stitching along, happy as Larry, minding my own business, and this has happened. I've ended up with a big horrid knot. Knots are really, really common in cross stitch, especially when you're using a lot of stranded cotton, and especially when you're using cotton that's quite long, but often they're actually quite easy to remove. So what I'm going to do is just pop my needle in here, hold this end of the thread, that's the wrong end, hold the other end of the thread, and then just pull, and pop, our knot comes out. So don't worry too much about knots. Most of the time they will come out. If they don't come out and you find that you absolutely have no choice but to cut them out, just make sure that you maybe pull out a few threads to give yourself a long tail so that you can weave in the tail of the stitches that are already there, and then you can move on and start your next stitch. So I have been stitching away like a busy bee, and our angel, the cotton part of our angel, the 2/2 part of our angel, as you can see, is finished. I've also done her face and her hands. They're stitched over one. I'm going to talk about them in the following video. But just for now, we're looking at the bulk of her body. So her wings, her hair, they were all stitched over too. Her dress, the ribbons, and then the bottom of her dress here. There are gaps, massive gaps, as you can see. They are for the speciality threads and for the beads that we're going to be talking about in the following videos and on the following blog posts. So here's our angel. She's starting to take shape. She obviously needs all of her lovely embellishments. And like I said, her face and her hands were stitched over one, and that's what the next video is going to be all about.